The sky over Europe was never silent in 1943. It roared. Engines screamed like metal beasts tearing through clouds. Bombers moved in tight formation, their silver bodies reflecting flashes of distant explosions. Inside one of them, 9 American airmen sat strapped into their stations, each pretending not to notice how violently their hands shook. No one spoke, because they all knew something was wrong. The aircraft had already been hit. Flak had torn through the fuselage minutes earlier, ripping metal like paper. One engine was coughing black smoke. Another was losing power. The tail gunner kept checking his ammo belt, even though he hadn't fired yet. He just needed something to do with his hands. The pilot stared forward, jaw tight. "Hold formation," he muttered. But the bomber was falling behind. And falling behind meant one thing over enemy territory. You become prey. The sky around them suddenly changed. Not visually. Not yet. But every man on that plane felt it. The same instinct soldiers feel in trenches. The same instinct hunters feel in forests. They were being watched. Miles away, cutting through the clouds with surgical precision, a German fighter pilot had already seen them. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't rushed. He was calm, frighteningly calm, because he was one of the best. His aircraft sliced through the air like a blade. He had intercepted dozens of bombers before. He knew their weak spots. He knew how they tried to escape. He knew exactly where to fire to end a mission in seconds. To him, this wasn't chaos. This was routine. He tilted his wings slightly, adjusting his angle as he approached the damaged American bomber from below. Smoke trailing from its engine made it stand out like a wounded animal bleeding in the snow. Easy target. Too easy. Inside the American plane, the tail gunner suddenly froze. "I see him." For words. Every man's heart slammed against his ribs. The pilot didn't turn. Didn't blink. Where? 6 o'clock, closing fast. Silence. Then training took over. Guns locked into position. Eyes snapped to sights. Fingers hovered over triggers. Breath slowed. Fear buried itself beneath muscle memory. They had seconds left. Outside, the German fighter drew closer. The distance shrank rapidly. He could already see the bullet holes along the bomber's side. Could see torn metal. Could see damage that told him something important. This plane wasn't making it home. He had done this long enough to know the signs. Usually, this was the moment he fired. One burst. That's all it ever took. But this time, he didn't. He kept approaching. Inside the bomber, the gunner whispered, "Why isn't he shooting?" No one answered. Because no one knew. The German pilot moved closer still, until he was near enough to see faces through the glass. Not shapes. Faces. Young faces. One of the Americans locked eyes with him. For a split second, war disappeared. There were no countries. No uniforms. No orders. Just 2 men. Looking at each other. The German pilot's finger rested on the trigger. He had permission. He had orders. He had every reason to fire. But something stopped him. Something no training manual had ever mentioned. He noticed the damage again. The shredded tail. The wounded engine. The way the bomber struggled to stay level. They weren't fighting anymore. They were trying to survive. Inside his cockpit, a thought crossed his mind that would have gotten him court-martialed if spoken aloud. This isn't a battle. This is an execution. He circled slightly, still within firing range. The American crew waited for bullets. None came. Instead, the German fighter pulled up beside them. Close enough to touch. The men inside the bomber stared in disbelief. They could see him clearly now. Goggles. Helmet. Oxygen mask. Eyes. Calm eyes. He wasn't aiming. He wasn't attacking. He was watching them. The co-pilot whispered, barely audible. "What is he doing?" No one answered. Because what was happening made no sense. Enemy fighters did not fly beside damaged bombers. Enemy fighters did not hesitate. Enemy fighters did not spare targets. But this one had. And none of them knew why. Not yet. The distance between the 2 aircraft was now so small that turbulence from the fighter's wings rattled the wounded bomber's frame. Inside the American plane, every gun was still trained on the German pilot. But no one fired. Because no one understood what they were looking at. The German fighter slid slightly forward, positioning himself where the Americans could see him clearly through the cockpit glass. His aircraft was perfectly steady, as if the chaos of war did not exist for him. Smoke from the bomber drifted past his canopy, briefly swallowing his plane in a gray cloud before the wind tore it away again. He studied them, counted them, not as targets, as men. The American pilot kept his hands tight on the controls, resisting the urge to dive or turn. He knew sudden movement might trigger the German to fire. So he held course, slow, damaged, exposed. Waiting. Seconds passed. Then something happened none of them expected. The German pilot raised his hand. Not to fire. To signal. At first, the Americans thought it was a trick. Maybe he wanted them distracted. Maybe he was stalling until other fighters arrived. The tail gunner tightened his grip on the trigger. Say the word, he said quietly. But the pilot didn't speak. Because the German wasn't acting like a hunter. He gestured again, sharper this time. A motion of his hand, pointing away, toward the horizon. The co-pilot frowned. What is he telling us? No answer. The German pilot repeated the gesture. Point. Look. Go. He wanted them to leave. Inside his cockpit, his thoughts were racing. He could see the truth written across the bomber's body. Torn metal, shattered glass, leaking fuel. He knew anti-aircraft batteries lay ahead. He knew German fighters patrolled nearby sectors. If this crippled plane kept flying straight, it would fly directly into a wall of death. They wouldn't make it 10 minutes. He had intercepted bombers many times before. He had watched them explode, watched parachutes bloom, watched wreckage fall like burning rain. But he had never been this close. Never close enough to see their fear. Never close enough to realize how young they looked. Orders echoed in his memory. Clear, sharp, unquestionable. Destroy enemy bombers. No exceptions. No mercy. War did not reward hesitation. War punished it. His finger rested on the trigger again. One squeeze. That was all. The cannons would tear through the bomber's fuselage. The damaged plane would break apart instantly. Flames. Debris. Silence. Mission complete. Instead, he pulled his hand away. Inside the American bomber, confusion was turning into disbelief. Why doesn't he shoot? The radio operator whispered. The tail gunner swallowed. I don't think he's going to. But none of them relaxed. Because this felt impossible. The German pilot moved his aircraft slightly ahead of the bomber's nose, then looked back and signaled again, more urgently now. Turn. Leave. Go. It finally clicked for the American pilot. He's guiding us. The words sounded ridiculous even as he said them. Enemy fighters did not guide bombers to safety. Yet that was exactly what it looked like. Outside, the German fighter gently banked left, then straightened, demonstrating the direction. He stayed just ahead, making sure they could see him. Not threatening. Not aiming. Leading. Inside his chest, his heart was pounding harder than it ever had in combat. Because he knew what he was risking. If German ground gunners saw this. If another fighter spotted him escorting the enemy. If command learned what he was doing. He wouldn't just be punished. He would be branded a traitor. Still, he stayed. Behind him, the bomber followed. Not because they trusted him. Because they had no other chance. The damaged aircraft slowly shifted course, engines straining, frame shuddering. The American crew watched the German fighter every second, half expecting him to suddenly turn and fire. He didn't. He kept flying ahead of them like a silent guardian. Minutes passed. Clouds drifted. The horizon changed. And for the first time since their mission began, no one was shooting. Inside the bomber, something strange spread through the crew. Not relief. Something rarer. Hope. The tail gunner lowered his weapon slightly. I think he's protecting us. No one laughed. Because deep down, every man felt it too. Ahead, the German pilot scanned the sky constantly. He checked above, below, behind. Watching for patrols. Watching for flak bursts. Watching for anything that could threaten the wounded aircraft behind him. He had made his decision. Now he had to see it through. Because turning back now would mean they died. And he knew it. The coastline was still far away. Danger still surrounded them. But for these few impossible minutes, in a sky built for killing, an enemy fighter was risking everything to keep them alive. The sky ahead looked calm. Too calm. Veteran pilots feared skies like this more than storms. Because storms were honest. Storms warned you. But clear skies could hide death at any second. The German fighter pilot's eyes kept moving, scanning, measuring, calculating. Years of combat had trained him to read the air the way sailors read the sea. And right now, something felt wrong. Behind him, the wounded bomber struggled to stay level. Its engine coughed again, trailing a darker streak of smoke. The vibration had gotten worse. He could practically feel it through the air between them. They didn't have much time. He glanced toward the distant horizon. still miles from safety, still deep inside enemy-controlled territory. Inside the bomber, the Americans were beginning to understand the reality of their situation. The navigator checked their position again. The radio operator tried the headset. Nothing but static. The tail gunner kept watching the German fighter, unable to fully lower his weapon, even now. Trust didn't come easily in war, especially not when the man protecting you was supposed to kill you. Suddenly, the German pilot stiffened. Movement. High above. His eyes snapped upward. Tiny specks. At first they looked harmless. Dust against the sky. But his instincts screamed the truth before his mind finished confirming it. Aircraft. Multiple. His pulse spiked. Because he knew what that meant. Patrol fighters. German patrol fighters. If they saw this scene, a German interceptor flying escort for an American bomber, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't hesitate. They wouldn't care about explanations. They would attack. And they would attack both planes. The German pilot made a decision instantly. He swung his fighter upward and to the side, placing himself between the distant specks and the damaged bomber. From below, it might have looked like nothing. Just another fighter adjusting course. But inside his cockpit, everything had changed. This wasn't Esker. From a distance, it could look like he had already captured them, or was escorting them to a German airfield. It was the only lie he could create fast enough to protect them. But it was also a gamble, because if the approaching pilots got closer, they would see the truth. Seconds dragged. The specks grew larger. Closer. Inside his cockpit, sweat slid down the German pilot's temple despite the freezing altitude. His jaw tightened. He adjusted his wings slightly, keeping his body positioned like a shield between the bomber and the incoming formation. Behind him, the Americans watched in stunned silence. They understood now. He wasn't just sparing them. He was risking himself. The navigator whispered, almost reverently, "He's covering us." No one responded, because no one had words for what they were witnessing. The distant fighters shifted slightly in formation. For a terrifying second, it looked like they were descending. The German pilot's heart slammed against his ribs. If they came closer, it was over. He kept flying steady, calm, controlled, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if this escort were routine, as if he had full authority over the situation. Inside, every nerve in his body was on fire. The seconds stretched into something unbearable. Then, the distant formation tilted, turned, and slowly began to drift away. The German pilot didn't breathe. Not yet. He kept his position, kept the illusion, kept acting. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Only when the aircraft were nothing but fading specks again did he finally exhale. Behind him, inside the battered bomber, 9 Americans stared at the man who had just saved them for the second time. No words. No cheers. Just stunned silence. Because they all realized the same thing at once. That pilot hadn't just disobeyed orders. He had gambled his life on strangers. The German fighter slowly dropped back down beside them again, wings steady, engine humming like a calm heartbeat. For a brief moment, the two aircraft flew side by side once more. Enemies. Separated by glass and steel. Connected by something far stronger. Humanity. The coastline was finally visible now, a thin line cutting across the horizon. Freedom was close, but the most dangerous decision of all was still ahead of him. The coastline stretched across the horizon like a promise. Gray, distant, fragile, but real. Inside the damaged bomber, every man could see it now. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others stared silently, afraid to blink, as if looking away might make it disappear. They weren't safe yet. Not even close. But for the first time since the mission began, survival didn't feel impossible. Outside, the German fighter pilot saw it too. The line that separated war from escape. His escort had worked. Against logic. Against orders. Against everything he had been trained to do. The American bomber was almost out of reach of German defenses. Anti-aircraft batteries wouldn't fire that far. Patrol routes thinned near the boundary. Within minutes, Allied territory would begin, which meant his task was ending. Slowly, deliberately, he eased his aircraft closer one final time until he was flying wingtip to wingtip with the crippled bomber. Inside the American cockpit, the pilot turned his head. There he was, clear as day, the man who should have killed them, the man who didn't. They looked at each other again through the glass and rushing wind. No radios, no shared language, no words at all. Yet somehow, everything was understood. The German pilot studied their faces one last time. The gunner with tired eyes. The co-pilot gripping a checklist he wasn't reading. The navigator still clutching his maps. The radio operator frozen mid-movement. The pilot holding the controls like they were the only solid thing left in the world. He memorized them, because he knew he would never see them again. Inside his chest, something tightened. Not fear this time, not adrenaline. Something heavier. He had seen hundreds of enemy aircraft before. He had shot many down. He remembered none of those faces. But these he would remember for the rest of his life. Inside the bomber, the Americans felt it too. That strange, silent understanding passing between them and the man beside them in the sky. No one raised a weapon now. No one even thought about it. The war, for this brief, impossible moment, had stepped aside. The German pilot slowly lifted his hand. Not urgently this time. Not signaling. Not warning. Just raising it. A gesture simple enough to mean nothing, and powerful enough to mean everything. Inside the bomber, the American pilot stared. His throat tightened. He understood. Slowly, he lifted his own hand from the controls and returned the gesture. Two pilots. Two enemies. Saluting each other in the middle of a war that demanded they destroy one another. For a second that seemed to suspend time itself, they held that silent salute across the narrow strip of air between them. No cameras. No witnesses. No history books. Just 10 men in the sky. 9 who had been spared. 1 who had chosen to spare them. Then the German pilot nodded once. Sharp. Respectful. Final. He pulled his hand back to the controls. Duty was waiting for him again. War was waiting. With a gentle roll of his wings, he banked away. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just enough. His fighter began to drift off to the side, then downward, peeling away like a guardian spirit fading into cloud. Inside the bomber, no one spoke. They watched him go. Watched the aircraft that could have ended them, but didn't. The tail gunner was the last to see him. Through the rear glass, he watched the German fighter shrink into the distance. Smaller. Smaller. Gone. Silence filled the bomber cabin. Not the tense silence of fear. A different kind. The kind that follows something sacred. Finally, the co-pilot exhaled slowly. Did that really just happen? No one answered, because none of them were sure they could explain it. Ahead, the coastline grew larger. The engines still struggled. The plane was still wounded. They still weren't safe. But something inside every man on board had changed forever, because they had just witnessed something no training manual could prepare them for. Mercy. And far behind them, turning back toward enemy skies, the German pilot flew alone again, carrying a secret he could never report, never confess, never prove. A secret that, if discovered, would destroy him. Yet he didn't regret it. Not for a second. Because he knew the truth history would never record. Today, he had won a different kind of victory. Not over enemies. Over war itself. Years passed. The war ended. The guns fell silent. The skies that once roared with engines slowly returned to peace. Nations rebuilt. Soldiers went home. Medals were awarded. Graves were visited. And the world moved on. But for one American pilot, the war never truly left. He had survived missions. He had seen aircraft fall from the sky. He had watched friends disappear into smoke and flame. Those memories stayed with him like shadows that never quite faded. Yet one memory stood apart from all the others. Not a battle. Not a victory. A moment. A moment when an enemy had chosen mercy. For decades, he told almost no one. Because who would believe it? That a German fighter pilot had spared his crippled bomber, protected it, escorted it, saluted him, and let him live? It sounded like fantasy. Like a story too perfect for war. Still, he never forgot the face behind that glass canopy. The calm eyes. The steady wings. The silent salute. The American pilot's name was Charlie Brown. And he carried that memory for nearly half a century. He built a life. He had a family. He grew older. But the question never stopped haunting him. Who was that pilot? He didn't want revenge. He wanted answers. So he began searching. Letters. Veteran groups. Military records. Aviation circles. Anyone who might know of a German fighter pilot who had once refused to fire. Years passed with nothing. Then one day a reply came. From Germany. A former Luftwaffe pilot had read about his story. He said he might know who the man was. The name in the letter was Franz Stigler. Brown's hands trembled as he read. The letter explained that Stigler had once told a strange story after the war. a story about a damaged American bomber he had encountered and couldn't bring himself to shoot. For decades, Stigler had wondered if anyone survived that plane, just like Brown had wondered who he was. Two men, on opposite sides of history, both searching for each other. When they finally spoke by phone for the first time, there was a long silence after the introductions. Neither knew what to say, because how do you speak to someone who once held your life in his hands? Finally, Brown asked quietly, "Why didn't you shoot?" On the other end of the line, Stigler's voice was calm, older now, but steady. "I saw you were not fighting. You were trying to live. I could not shoot. It would have been murder." Brown closed his eyes. For 50 years, he had wondered. Now he knew. They talked for hours, not as former enemies, as men who shared a moment no one else on Earth could truly understand. Soon after, they decided to meet in person. When they finally stood face to face for the first time since that day in the sky, neither saluted. They stepped forward and embraced. Two old men, once enemies, now something else. From that day on, they stayed close friends for the rest of their lives. They spoke often, visited each other, told their story together, not as a tale of war, but as proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion can still exist. People later asked them what they considered each other. Not rivals, not survivors, not soldiers, brothers. Because high above a battlefield long ago, before history knew their names, before time turned them into old men, one pilot had looked at another and chosen mercy instead of war. And that choice echoed across 50 years, until two former enemies could finally shake hands beneath a peaceful sky.